Now I have a pleasure to have Dr. Maria Oquendo. She's professor of clinical psychiatry and vice chair for education in psychiatry at Columbia University. Dr. Oquendo has an expertise in diagnosis, pharmacologic treatment, in neurobiology of mood disorders with emphasis in suicidal behavior.
Bom dia. First of all, I want to thank Professor Jair Mari for his kind invitation. It's a delight to be here in Sao Paulo, and I'm very grateful to my co-presenters, Professor Herman and Professor Hakornosen, because they clearly adopted to the fact that I forgot to take my faciracetam this morning and got a little confused about the schedule, so thank you for your flexibility. So I'm going to be talking to you today about estimating risk for suicide attempt and the development of prevention strategies, and these are my disclosures. And what I'd like to start with is a definition of suicidal behavior. And those of you who are interested in suicidal behavior may know that there's been a tremendous amount of discussion back and forth with different views on how to classify self-injury, in particular because of the critical issue that sometimes it's very difficult to know what an individual's intent was. And so, for example, if you talk to the British investigators or the European investigators, they often will express a very serious preference for referring to this type of behavior as deliberate self-harm. And one of the issues that we have with this is that, unfortunately, it ends up putting together even more heterogeneity in the types of study of behavior that we're then looking at. So you end up lumping together behaviors such as suicide or death and non-suicidal self-injury, for example, the behaviors that some adolescents engage in with superficial cutting or burning to relieve distress. And so we've worked very closely with the Centers for Disease Control at in the US and also with the Food and Drug Administration to come up with a centralized definition for use for research, at least in the US. And this definition has also been adopted for investigation by the DSM-5. And the idea is that we're looking at behaviors where the individual engages in a behavior to injure him or herself with at least some intent to die. And of course that means that sometimes we have to infer that, because many times, especially those of you who are clinicians and work in an emergency room, many times you see people who come in after a suicide attempt and they will deny that they were trying to kill themselves. So oftentimes the clinician is stuck making a judgment about what they believe is going on with that behavior. Now, I should tell you that, of course, it's not uncommon for individuals who have non-suicidal self-injury to also have suicide attempts. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that even though we can conceptualize these behaviors as separate types of behaviors, that in fact they co-occur often in a given individual. And one of the other things that I wanted to draw your attention to is that oftentimes people use the term suicidality to mean suicidal ideation, suicide attempt, death by suicide. But it's really a difficult term for us because already in psychiatry we have the trouble of having very heterogeneous categories. So the more specific we can be, the more likely it is that we'll be able to identify both clinical and neurobiological risk factors and therefore develop strategies for prevention. So this is just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the problem. First of all, the estimate is that about 1 million people kill themselves every year worldwide. And it's the third leading cause of death for youth under the age of 24. And about 1.8 billion US dollars are lost in income because of suicide. The other thing that I want you to take away from this is that there's a tremendous amount of heterogeneity in the rates, and the dark gray just means that we don't have data for those countries, but you can see that there are many countries that have, relatively low rates, and others that have, these rates are on average in the 60 per 100,000. The rates in most of South America are less than 6 per 100,000. So you can see that there's tremendous variability worldwide in terms of suicide death. And one way to think about it is we need to have a model for understanding this behavior. I think that typically in our cultures we think of suicide as a behavior that's a response to overwhelming catastrophic stress. But in fact, stress is ubiquitous. And so one way to conceptualize it is to take a step back and think about completed suicides. What we know about completed suicides is that about 90% of them meet criteria for at least one psychiatric illness, often more than that. And in fact, if you look at the individual diagnoses that these people have, oftentimes it's about 60% of them will have some type of mood disorder. Conversely, if you look at individuals with major affective disorders, unipolar and bipolar disorders, what you'll see is that actually a relatively small fraction of them may be between, even in bipolar disorder, the highest estimates are 20%. So it's only a small fraction of them end up committing suicide. So what you can infer from that is that psychiatric illness is not a sufficient condition for suicidal behavior, but it probably is a necessary condition. So how can we further refine a model? So one way that we think about it is that there's some people who evidently have a diathesis or a predisposition towards acting on suicidal thoughts. And so they may go from a situation where they're in an environment, perhaps having some environmental risks, maybe they have access to lethal means, maybe they don't have any access to care, and they can go into a situation where they go from having suicidal ideation, and from not having this, to developing suicidal ideation, and in the context of traits like impulsivity or aggression or cognitive inflexibility, they actually have a trigger, perhaps a psychiatric illness, perhaps an exacerbation of their condition, and then they go over the threshold into suicidal behavior. And one of the things that's helpful about this is that we have two opportunities to intervene. One of the things we can do is, for example, intervene to prevent recurrence of psychiatric episodes. And another, of course, is to try to address some of these risk factors and lower the risk in that fashion. And then the third, and towards the end of my lecture, I'll talk about some of the environmental risks and strategies that we can use to attack this other group of risk factors. So we've developed and refined a model, a neurodevelopmental model for suicidal acts that seeks to put together biological and clinical observations about suicidal behavior and individuals who are suicidal to try to have a cohesive view of how an individual can develop this diathesis that I'm describing to you with all of these clinical and biological features and go on to express suicidal behavior. So the notion is that individuals have a particular genetic endowment that may predispose them to this diathesis. They are, in the context of this endowment, exposed to childhood adversity. Perhaps they are physically abused or sexually abused. Perhaps they're neglected. Perhaps they're exposed to civil strife or war. And in combination, these two types of domains, perhaps having a causal factor, work together to make huge impacts on biological measures. So for example, we see very important changes in terms of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. We see noradrenergic changes in terms of neurochemical changes, serotonergic changes, and one of the newer things that we're looking at now is how immune cytokines interact with all these three domains, perhaps also contributing to risk and inflammation. And that these biological markers, these biological changes, neurochemical changes, can very clearly be linked to clinical phenotypes that we've identified as being important in individuals who are suicidal or commit suicide. So let's start with the genetics. One of the things that we know about genetics is that it varies from condition to condition how much the genetics actually contribute. And we know, I like this slide because it shows that even though we think of our illnesses as not being all that genetic, actually major depression and schizophrenia are pretty high up there compared to some of the other conditions on this slide. And in a way, this helps us understand that, yes, genes are important, but certainly there's not a one-to-one relationship between your genetic makeup and what your behavior is later. And that's very helpful because it means that there is opportunity for intervention. And so that means that when you have, especially when you're looking at complex behaviors like suicidal behaviors, you're not going to have a Mendelian type of inheritance. These are likely to be polygenic types of conditions where you have multiple genetic domains contributing to the risk, and also that some people may have the same genotype and different expression, and other people may have different genotypes and some of the same phenotypes. And I think that this very nicely comports with what Dr. Håkansson was talking about in terms of needing these huge samples to be able to detect signals in genetic material just because of the interactions between environment and other factors that contribute to expression of genes. But suicidal behavior is definitely genetic. We know from, certainly this is a family that's very heavily influenced by that genetic endowment. And this is from a study that we've been doing together with the University of Pittsburgh, where we showed that if you look at individuals who are depressed and suicide attempters, and you compare them with individuals who are depressed but have never made a suicide attempt, when you compare their children, the children of suicide attempters are much more likely to make attempts themselves. And that the age of risk seems to be, for this type of suicidal behavior, between ages 10 or 15 and 30. And further, that if you have a multiplex family, that is a family where not only the parent is a suicide attempter, but let's say the aunt or the uncle is a suicide attempter, then the risk is increased even further. So in terms of risk for suicidal behavior, what you see is that when there are two individuals in, like a father and an uncle, for example, who are suicide attempters, then not only does the suicidal behavior occur earlier, but it goes up to exactly the same level as if there's only one parent. Again, supporting this idea that the genetic contribution is quite critical. And then, of course, but it's not everything, because we know that this is just to illustrate the idea that, for example, you can have a mutation, as in the person 1 and person 2, right? You can go from an alanine to an adenosine to a guanine and then not have a change in the protein. And so this is another element that complicates looking at point mutations, certainly. And then there are other situations where you can have similarly one nucleotide change and have a difference in the amino acid and perhaps lead to a difference in the protein. So this is one way in which genetic variability, you can have different genotypes and still have similar behaviors. And the other thing, of course, is that we know that the environment has a tremendous effect. And so we can have individuals who have subthreshold syndrome. You can have people who have clinical phenotypes. And some of them will have, even with the same genetic endowment, will be able to, depending on their environment, whether it's intrauterine, perinatal, or early childhood especially, depending on this environment, they may be in these different areas in terms of their manifestation of symptoms. And at the same time, you may have individuals who look clinically very much like this genotype, for example, but really are a phenocopy and totally unrelated genetically. And I think that's some of the challenge. And of course, a lot of this information has come from animal studies, especially mouse studies, where we can really carefully control the intrauterine environment. You can use genetically controlled animals and expose them to different intrauterine stresses and perinatal stresses, and see the effects on the environmental effects on the phenotype, possibly mediated by epigenetic changes. And we know that things like methylation and acetylation have a very important role in terms of either making DNA available for transcription and therefore for protein synthesis, or for, if you will, hiding the DNA and not making it available for transcription. I think this helps us understand why genes are not destiny. Sorry, I skipped one. And this is, of course, a paper that you're all familiar with, which was one of the first papers to demonstrate that if you have stressful life events, there's an interaction with your genetic endowment. And the more stressful life events you have, then the more likelihood you have of a suicide attempt if you happen to have the short allele of the serotonin transporter. Whereas if you have the two copies of the long allele, really the number of stressful life events early in life seem not to be quite as important. And I think that this has made it, given us a very interesting paradigm for understanding the relationship between genetics and biology. Now, one of the other things that we know the environment does is stimulate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis in terms of stress response. And so when we're exposed to stress, we have a brain response with hypothalamic release of corticotropin-releasing hormone, which stimulates the pituitary gland to release ACTH, and then cortisol goes into the bloodstream, preparing the system for, if you will, fight or flight. So what that does is release more glucose into the bloodstream so that we're ready to flight. It inhibits inflammation and has a number of effects on the body, preparing the organism to deal with whatever stressor they're confronting in the environment. And of course, this system doesn't work all by itself. It actually also has incredibly important interactions with neurotransmitters, so that we have a very close interaction between cortisol functioning and the serotonin 1A receptor, especially in hippocampus. And again, learning is very much influenced by the cortisol that's circulating. And those of you who've had a stressful experience can probably recall it pretty well, if unless you developed PTSD and blocked it out. But you know, one of the things that I think is helpful for us to understand is that none of these systems work in isolation. And again, here you can see that cortisol has its effect, yes, definitely directly on releasing glucose into the bloodstream, but also in terms of suppressing the immune system, which also has consequences for brain function and interacts with the serotonin system as well. So in terms of the serotonin system, perhaps the most carefully studied biological system within suicide is the serotonin system. And there are a tremendous amount of findings, and I'm just going to give you a very brief summary of them. But we know essentially that there are clear abnormalities in ventral prefrontal cortex, and I'll show you a couple of pictures, and also decreases in serotonin functioning in the brainstem. And the dorsal and median raphe nuclei, especially the dorsal raphe nuclei, is where the bodies of the serotonin receptors reside. So it makes sense that these would be affected very importantly. And there's very rich innervation of the entire neocortex by serotonin fibers. And here's a study from Peter Nordstrom from the Karolinska showing that if you look at individuals who made a suicide attempt and you measure their serotonin metabolite in their spinal fluid, those individuals who have lower CSF, lower serotonin metabolites, are much more likely to commit suicide and do so earlier than those who had more serotonin metabolites. Again, suggesting that lower serotonin function has an important role in suicidal behavior. Similarly here, we see that not only is there a relationship between, this is serotonin metabolites in cerebrospinal fluid again, not only does it have an important role and correlation with suicidal behavior, where you see that the suicidal individuals who have this little line through them are in the lower part of this graph, but also that more aggressive individuals have lower serotonin, and again linking this behavioral phenotype of aggression, which is so closely related to suicidal behavior, at least in some subtypes of suicide phenotypes. And interestingly, you can show this same relationship in rhesus monkeys and clearly show the relationship between aggressive behaviors and low serotonin metabolites in cerebrospinal fluid. In postmortem brain, we can also see very important differences, and these are just deeper red stain means that there are more serotonin transporters. And if you look at individuals with depression compared to individuals who have no depression but have committed suicide, what you'll see is that the distribution of the serotonin transporter is very different. So that for major depression, the distribution is much more widely distributed. The decrease is much more widely distributed, whereas in suicide, it's much more localized to the ventral prefrontal cortex. And that makes sense because you can think of the ventral prefrontal cortex as being the area of the brain that really is in charge of inhibitory control, which you can imagine would be very relevant to acting on suicidal urges or acting on aggressive urges. Goodness. We do want to be efficient, but that was too much. And this is an imaging study showing the relationship between serotonin function and impulsivity, and the fact that individuals who are more impulsive have lower lethality of their suicidal behavior, and that makes sense because they plan less poorly. And you can actually see the relationship between that in prefrontal cortex areas in suicide attempters, again, making this link between serotonergic function, impulsivity, and suicidal behavior. And again, just to make the link again between aggressive behaviors and suicidal behavior, similar areas have been implicated in individuals who are incarcerated for murder. And again, the whole notion being that there's something in that ventral prefrontal cortex region where inhibitory control is exerted that's abnormal, both in individuals who have aggressive behaviors that are externally oriented and individuals who are suicidal. The other system that's extremely important in suicide, but also in stress response, is the noradrenergic system. And as you know, the locus coeruleus is where all of the cell bodies for the noradrenergic system is, and like the serotonin system, the noradrenergic system has very rich innervation of the entire neocortex, and we know that the autonomic nervous system is also quite critical in terms of responding to stress and activation in the context of organismic response to external stressful stimuli. And it's important for arousal, for concentration, and for motivation as well. And one of the other important points is that, of course, the noradrenergic system communicates very closely with that other system that I mentioned to you that was very important in stress response, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And this is just a very lovely picture from Mark Underwood and Vicky Arango's lab, showing all of these little dots. The black dots are where actually there is CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone innervation, and these cell bodies are noradrenergic cell neurons in brain, again showing a beautiful communication between these two stress response systems, which are so important for responding to your environment. And interestingly, if you look at animal models, if you deplete their noradrenaline, what you see is animals that tend to give up, if you will. Or if another way to think about it, maybe if we can be anthropomorphic for a minute, it's almost like the animals are pessimistic, like they just don't persevere in the face of things. And so, for example, when you expose rats to inescapable restraint, that depletes their noradrenergic, and that leads to a despair or giving up type of phenotype, which people have used as a model for depression, if you will. So one of the hypotheses that we've had is whether pessimism, which we observe so closely in individuals who tend towards suicidal behavior, is related to this noradrenergic depletion that we see so clearly in animal models. So I mentioned to you that immunity is also very important, and cytokines, I think, there's been an explosion of research in the last 10 years looking at immune function. And although much of the work that's been done has looked at inflammation itself in depression, we're now also starting to understand the role that it has in suicide. And importantly and critically and very poorly examined to date is the interaction, as I mentioned before, between neuroinflammation and the HPA axis, right? I mentioned to you that cortisol and immune function are very closely linked and talk to each other, if you will, and also that serotonin and serotonergic functions and cytokine functions also are very closely linked. And interestingly as well, if you look at childhood maltreatment, what you can see is that different measures of inflammation, like C-reactive protein, white blood cell counts, there's an inflammation factor, or fibrinogen, that if you have probable or definite childhood maltreatment, you're going to have higher levels of these inflammatory markers in your blood. Again, suggesting that some of the same stressors that we are thinking about are important for suicidal behavior have an effect, have an important impact in neuroinflammation. And this is interesting because we've seen, for example, that individuals who don't have major depression, for example, and are exposed to interferon will actually have a depressive response, about 70% of them. And you can actually measure their, not only their fibrinogen, but also ACTH levels, again linking the immune reaction to the cortisol reaction and to cortisol itself. In suicide attempters, you can find high levels of IL-6 and tumor necrosis factor, which are important cytokines, and violent suicide attempters have even higher levels of that. And some of the interesting information that's coming now from suicide attempts, which I think is suicide deaths, which is very helpful, is that even in individuals who have a mixture, if you look at a group of individuals who have a mixture of different diagnoses at the time of death, inflammation is still a very important marker and is abnormal compared to controls. And this is from Ghanshyam Pandey's lab at the University of Maryland. And you can see that for individuals with suicide, and these are suicidal teenagers who have everything from alcohol abuse to schizophrenia to conduct disorder. So it's not only that we're seeing depression and that it's being driven by depression, but all these three different markers for inflammation are elevated in the suicides compared to the dead controls. So in a way, you could think of that the neurobiology of suicide looks a lot like a stress response. And I think that starting to identify these different biological factors puts us closer to being able to use biomarkers as a way of identifying individuals at risk, especially if you think about the clinical challenge that we're often faced with individuals not really wanting to reveal what their thoughts are about suicide, and making it harder for us to do this clinically. And this is just from some work showing the role of both aggression and impulsivity, and that these have additive effects on the risk for suicidal behavior. This is in the context of mood disorders, but what you can see is that if you have both pessimism and aggression, you're going to have a much higher risk for suicidal behavior going forward. And one way we think about this is that this aggression is probably being affected at least in part by serotonergic function, and the pessimism is at least being affected in part by noradrenergic functioning. So, what are we going to do about prevention? So what that leaves us then is trying to figure out how to use all of these markers and also to influence the environment in terms of developing a prevention strategy. And what we can do is we can look at things to help us. We're very bad at preventing stressful life events. So most of our effort really has to be focused on intervening with either the mood or other psychiatric illnesses that are associated with suicidal behavior, intervening at the point that the person develops suicidal ideation, or intervening in these diathesis factors that I was mentioning to you before, impulsivity or hopeless and pessimism, or intervening in terms of some of the environmental factors, so access to lethal means or imitation. And so many of these things, this, for example, is amenable to certainly education and awareness for primary care physicians and the public, making sure that people come to treatment, that general practitioners identify depression and other individuals who are at risk, patients with schizophrenia, for example. Also, when you have screening programs for individuals at high risk, for example, in high schools, you may be able to identify these individuals who have already passed a threshold into developing suicidal ideation for interventions. And certainly we can use psychotherapies or pharmacologic interventions to try to affect things like impulsivity and hopelessness or pessimism. And restriction to access of lethal means, I think, through legislation. And in the United States, as you know, we are currently confronting a terrible problem with legislature coming through for gun control in the United States and all of the repercussions that brings with it. And then, of course, there's also imitation, which is a very big problem, especially for adolescents, and where we can have an impact by educating people in the media about reporting on these behaviors. So the types of things that have been done for prevention is to develop education and awareness programs, and also to train gatekeepers. And I'll say a little bit more about gatekeepers. Means restriction has also been studied very extensively, both in Europe and in the United States, but also now starting to be studied in Asia and Sri Lanka. And also the media impact has received some attention as well. In addition to these types of interventions, we also have, as I mentioned, clinical interventions that we can make, not only screening, for example, in high schools or in other high-risk settings, but also we can have pharmacotherapies, psychotherapies, or follow-up cares, especially for individuals, for example, who are being discharged from hospital and are high risk in that regard. So let me just say a few things about education. One of the things that I think is very critical is helping the public understand suicidal behavior as a biological and medical problem. I think that generally, in fact, this is one of my pet peeves about the media, and about once every 2 or 3 months I write a letter to the New York Times about this, because oftentimes in the media, and this is how the public ends up often being educated, suicides are presented as being responses to things in the environment. So for example, just recently there was an article on the cover of the New York Times about 2 Pakistani girls who poisoned themselves in the context of being prohibited from developing a relationship with a young man in the community. And the paper presented it as if this were the only thing that were going on, without any reflection on the possibility that perhaps there was something else going on with these young women, that maybe they suffered from depression, maybe they had some other problem going on, and that what that does is perpetuate this idea that suicidal behavior is in some way expected or understandable, and provides or actually interferes with our ability as clinicians to be able to intervene to protect individuals from suicidal behavior. So educating the public about this being a medical consequence of medical conditions that happen to be psychiatric in nature is extremely important, and also reducing stigma. So for example, helping individuals acknowledge and pass on information in their own families about suicidal behavior, so that the kids are educated about the risk for themselves and for other members of the family, and obtaining help is absolutely critical. Gatekeepers are also extremely important people to educate, because they oftentimes can have first access to people who are at risk. And people such as clergy and first responders, and yesterday there was a very nice presentation by one of the students about the fact that clergy are free. And so this is a very important opportunity that we can take advantage of by educating the clergy to identify those individuals who may have depression or may have psychosis or otherwise be at risk for suicidal behavior, and help them develop strategies for referring these patients to appropriate care. Also, first responders, for example, people who are firemen or policemen or drive ambulances. Those are very important gatekeepers to also educate about suicide risk. Pharmacists in many countries, certainly in Puerto Rico where I was raised, you can go to the pharmacy. If you have a problem, you tell the pharmacist your problem. You might not go to the doctor. And so also educating the pharmacists about recognizing suicide risk so that they also can intervene and make referrals. Geriatric caregivers as well. We know that the elderly, and especially in high-income countries where life expectancy is high, but geriatric individuals are at much higher risk for suicidal behavior. And also human resources staff. So for example, people who are in charge at the workplace for counseling people who come and are seeking help, employees who are seeking help. So in terms of the training, you prepare people for the training by telling them about sort of what their expectations should be about the learning experience. You know, we as clinicians and as mental health professionals kind of think of suicide as sort of like something we just talk about, but for a lot of people it's very difficult to talk about it. It's very taboo, and so it takes a lot of sort of preparing the ground, if you will, with the gatekeepers to help them start accepting the training and adjusting to the expectations, helping them discuss their own attitudes towards suicide. For example, in many religions, suicide is considered a sin. And so if the clergy has that type of attitude, that might make it more difficult for people in the parish or in the congregation to approach the clergy about such a problem. So helping the individual gatekeeper be in touch with their own biases or prejudices about suicidal behavior. Also, knowledge and skills in identifying risk factors and identifying a plan. Many times people come to gatekeepers in a time of crisis where it's very easy for the individual to get overwhelmed. So having a very clear strategy, having very clear plans about what to do in such a case is extremely helpful for the gatekeeper in terms of organizing their response to this crisis situation. And having a model for prevention to be able to assist the individual. And so, for example, using role-playing to help the person work in this regard, or using simulation. Thank you. And also, every community has different resources. So when you're doing this kind of gatekeeper training, it's important to have someone from the community who could give realistic recommendations about what resources are available in any given community to help in the crisis situation. Now, one of the things that I think is important is that there are only a few studies who have looked at gatekeeper training. Usually they're done, these interventions are delivered together with other interventions, so we don't really know how effective this particular part of the intervention is, so we definitely need more information about that. And a few words about means restrictions. What we know is that there's a very clear correlation between the number of firearms and suicide rates. Certainly the southwest of the United States, where firearm ownership is very high, has a much higher suicide rate. Of course, there are fewer doctors and the population is more rural there, which may also contribute, but I think that's important. Control of pesticides. There are some new studies that Keith Houghton from Oxford has been doing in Sri Lanka with locking up of pesticides and also introducing less toxic pesticides have shown decrements in suicides in Sri Lanka, which has one of the highest suicide rates in the country. The same with detoxification of domestic gas. This was an intervention that was implemented in the UK in the 70s with a very dramatic reduction in suicide deaths. And interestingly, it's not that individuals did not simply substitute for a different intervention. So in fact, reducing the availability of that particular lethal mean did decrease things. The same is not true for putting up barriers for a bridge. If you put up barriers for a bridge but there's another bridge nearby, the risk will stay high. But if there's not access to that particular type of suicide method, then you can see decreases. Interestingly, also in terms of medications, also in the UK, the paracetamol overdose suicides went down significantly when the pharmacies stopped selling paracetamol in big jars. Instead, they were bubble wrapped, so you had to take each little pill. You have to be very persistent to do that and get a whole bunch of pills. So, very simple interventions can really make a big difference in terms of reduce lethal means. This is about media, and I think that we have good evidence from several studies that if you actually don't glamorize suicide, if you clearly link it to something that's viewed as a pathological behavior in the community, that's very helpful in terms of not increasing the likelihood of contagion in a particular community. And one of the things that we've all been very concerned about and that we don't have a lot of research on yet is what the role of the internet is. I mean, we certainly hear reports of individuals who make suicide pacts on the internet and such, and I think that we have a lot of work to do to understand how we can better intervene in that regard. And we are working with some people who do data mining, use data mining strategies to identify word patterns to see if we can help identify individuals who might be at risk. So I think that has some promise. I've mentioned screening several times. There is some evidence that it might be helpful for high school students or for juvenile offenders, two very high-risk groups. And importantly, it's very clear that simply asking about suicide does not increase risk. I think we as health professionals know this, but For many people in the lay population, they're afraid, especially with teenagers, to talk to them about suicide because they worry that they're going to put the idea in the person's head. I know we're low on time, but I'm almost finished. So we do have opportunities for prevention. 83% of suicides have seen a doctor the year before their death, and 66% have had contact within a month. So we do have opportunities to identify these individuals, and improved screening, especially for general medicine settings, will be very important. And these are some warning signs. Most of you know about this, but sort of lack of interest in previously pleasurable activities, when people withdraw socially. Some of these are, of course, symptoms of depression, like changes in eating and sleeping, persistent sadness and melancholy. But I think certainly unhealthy use of substances, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, self-injury, increases in self-injury, and when people talk about plans for suicide, I think also really critical to pay attention. And again, the frequency with which these kinds of conversations get dismissed is really surprising. So physician interventions are very, very useful. Studies in Sweden, Hungary, Japan, and Slovenia have shown that if you train general medical doctors to identify depression and treat it, you actually can have an impact on suicidal behavior and on suicide death. So these can be very important, and I'm actually working with Greg Simon at the University of Washington, implementing screening into a very large group of 20,000 people who are followed by a health plan to see if we can document the use of screening in the prevention of suicidal behavior. And we know also that we can treat people. We know that higher antidepressant rates are correlated with lower suicide rates, especially when we use low toxicity antidepressants like SSRIs, for example. And interestingly, if you look at youth suicides, 90% of them are not treated at the time of death. Again, showing that there's an opportunity here for intervening with pharmacotherapy. We have lots of psychotherapies that can help with the underlying problems. Cognitive therapy, problem-solving therapy. Dr. Weissman is here. Interpersonal therapy, very helpful for depression. And dialectical behavioral therapy, which targets self-injury and suicidal behavior, also can be very useful for these individuals. And I just want to mention safety planning, which is now being implemented in a very widespread area through the Veterans Administration hospital system. But basically, this is for people who are chronically suicidal, and I'm aware I just have one more minute, but I just want to emphasize that the beauty of this is that it engages the clinician and the patient in a dialogue about what can be done to prevent suicidal behavior. What can the patient do to decrease their own risk? So it's very empowering, but it also means that there's a very frank and open dialogue between the patient and the clinician to decrease risk for suicidal behavior, and making the environment safe is a very important component of this. So I can talk with people more individually if they're interested in this. And I think that we clearly need to continue to increase our knowledge about who's at risk, find markers that are both clinical and biological for risk so that we can intervene on targeted populations. We need, obviously, more evidence-based interventions that are specific for suicidal behavior, and we're currently working on quite a few of them. And again, working in developing countries to prevent suicide is something that I think is a huge unmet need. And you saw how many countries have absolutely no data, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. We clearly have a lot of work to do. So I'd like to thank my funders and also my collaborators, and to thank you for your attention.
And we have time for only one question.
Thank you very much for your kind lecture. I'd just like to ask you regarding the prediction of suicide. Probably this is one of the important issues. And if you could predict, do you think you can integrate HPA axis with other neurotransmitters like adrenergic system, serotonergic system, to predict a neurobiological risk of suicide?
That's a really good question. Actually, we have been doing studies looking at the prediction of suicidal behavior, and although we can find factors that predict suicide risk in, say, a 2-year period, and we've just submitted some work for publication, the amount of variance predicted by the biological markers that we've looked at so far is very small, which is very disappointing. And so what that tells us is that we're going to need to have a comprehensive model to predict suicide. The other thing that is very understudied is the prediction of imminent risk. So for example, we've spent a lot of time looking at what increases risk over the next 6 months, 1 year, but that doesn't help the doctor in the emergency room. And what we're doing now is focusing back to try to see if we can find predictors that are short-term by collecting data using smartphones, so that we monitor people several times a day to see if we can see patterns in the chain in terms of behavior, thought processes, stressors, and also we're starting to work on developing biological things that we can measure in this kind of fashion as well, to develop something a little bit more
Uh,
useful clinically, because right now we're really still at the theoretical level, I believe.
Do you think early life stress and childhood trauma could help in this model?
Well, I think that childhood trauma is an important predictor of suicidal behavior and of mood disorders and of a lot of untoward outcomes. But again, the problem is that it's not terribly specific. So in some populations, like if we look in our populations of depressed individuals, the rates of childhood trauma are about 25 to 30%. That's huge. And in general population groups, often the rates of childhood trauma reported by adults is in the 20% range. So it's a very common factor, and it's not, I don't think it's specific enough, unfortunately, but it's absolutely critical. You're right.
Maria, very nice presentation. My question is, do you think those cytokines and those compounds are just biomarkers, or they are somehow involved in the process by itself? So if you use anti-inflammatory drugs, do you think that you can help somehow to avoid suicide or something like that?
So the question is whether I think that cytokines are biomarkers of suicidal behavior. And we don't know that yet, but that is one of our hypotheses. And one of the interesting things about cytokines is that as you get an increment in cytokines, you actually see a change in the way that serotonin is metabolized, so that, for example, instead of tryptophan gets shunted away from going into the serotonergic pathway, you also get changes in the way that fatty acids are processed. And so all of these things that we've seen are linked or have been linked one-to-one with suicidal behavior and with other psychiatric problems, probably all work in concert. And until we have a very good model that helps us understand the different components, we'll be, I think, having a hard time with biomarkers, in particular because it's likely that part of the reason that we can't clarify our phenotype is that we're really studying lots of different things. And it may be that some of these, perhaps, I'm making this up, but perhaps cytokine biomarkers will be relevant to a specific type of suicidal behavior, for example. Thank you.
Thank you.